Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical's president and CEO, and I'm delighted to see so many of you in our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium today. Today's History with David M. Rubenstein program features a conversation between Mr. Rubenstein and the historian and legal scholar Annette Gordon-Reed. Mr. Rubenstein coined the phrase patriotic philanthropy, and indeed, he has focused much of his extraordinary giving on building and or improving institutions that convey our cultural patrimony. From 1977 to 1981, during the Carter administration, Mr. Rubenstein was Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. In addition to chairing the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, he chairs Duke University's Board of Trustees. He's also chairman of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution, co-chairman of the Brookings Institution, vice chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, a trustee of the National Gallery of Art, and president of the Economic Club of Washington. I'm thrilled to introduce Mr. Rubenstein's interviewee this evening, Annette Gordon-Reed. Professor Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School. In addition to her role at Harvard Law, Professor Gordon-Reed is a member of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and she is the Carol K. Forsheimer Professor at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. She's the author of many books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Hemings of Monticello and her latest, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, co-authored with Peter Omov. As always, I'd like to ask that you please make sure anything that makes a noise like a cell phone is switched off. And now, please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Thank you.
Put up mine as well.
Okay. We
Go
know
ahead.
Thomas Jefferson won't be calling, but...
Thank goodness.
So, you went to Harvard Law School.
Yes, I did.
And you grew up in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
You wanted to be a lawyer, or why'd you go to Harvard Law School?
Oh, there's a lot in that, David. I went to Harvard Law School because I thought that becoming a lawyer might be more practical than being a novelist and writing the great American novel.
Okay.
And I think it turned out to be.
Okay, so you did practice law for a while.
Yes, I did.
But how did you transform yourself from a Harvard Law School and a Harvard Law Review member and a person who practiced law at Cahill, Gordon, to someone who is now one of the best-known historians in our country? How did you make that transition?
Well, while I was practicing law at Cahill, and then for a time I was counsel to a small city agency here in New York City, I was writing. I was trying to write a book about W.E.B. Du Bois, and I found that practicing and raising children and all those kinds of things were hard to do if you, with all these different roles. And so I decided to try teaching, to go into academia, because you're actually supposed to write for there. And I went to New York Law School and was a professor there. And in 1994, I had been writing from the time I was a kid. I wrote short stories, I wrote essays and things. I read about a movie that was going to be made, Jefferson in Paris, that was going to talk about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and treat it as if it were true. And then there was a lot of controversy about that. And I decided to write an op-ed talking about the things that I knew about it, people saying there was no evidence that it had happened. And I found it sort of insulting to say that the words of Madison Hemings, who was the son of Sally Hemings, who said Thomas Jefferson was his father, and another an enslaved man, Israel Gillette, who said that, corroborated what he said, people were treating it as if, it wasn't true. So I thought, I'm a law professor. I can talk about evidence, and I know the way Jefferson scholars have handled this question, and I thought the way they handled it was pretty bad. So in my first book, I decided to be the law professor talking to historians and explaining to readers what the historians had gotten wrong. So that's how I got into it.
Okay. Well, let's go into this. You've written two books so far about this. One was the original book you wrote about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and then the other one's The Hemings of Monticello, which won the Pulitzer Prize. So for people who may not be familiar with the background, who was Sally Hemings, and when did Thomas Jefferson first meet her?
Well, um, Thomas met Sally.
Well,
Sally Hemings was the daughter of Elizabeth Hemings, who was an enslaved woman who belonged to a man named John Wales, who also happened to be Jefferson's father-in-law. So when Jefferson married Martha Wales, she brought to Monticello with her Elizabeth Hemings and the 6 children that Elizabeth Hemings had with John Wales, and one of them was Sally Hemings. So he would have met Sally Hemings when she was about 3. Or
Okay,
2 or
so
3.
to make sure everybody understands the background again, Thomas Jefferson, his wife, dies when he's 39. She died. She has given him 2 children who survive ultimately, I guess. But on her deathbed, she said, "I want you to promise me you'll never marry again." And he says,
Yes, he
Okay.
promised that. This is a story that's told by the members of the Hemings family. Martha Jefferson was had difficulty with childbearing, and she died as the result of complications from her.
so she
giving a
died.
child.
Thomas Jefferson had then already written the Declaration of Independence that had happened before and so forth, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he's 39, his wife dies, he's very distraught. She had been widowed, and he married her as when she was a widow, but they clearly were in love.
Oh, yes.
And so ultimately, he gets an assignment to go to France to more or less serve as our ambassador. Is that right?
Yes.
And he brought one of his daughters over?
He brought one daughter over. He went to Paris in 1784 with his eldest daughter, Martha, and he takes along with him a man named James Hemings, who was Sally Hemings' older brother, and he's going to be taught to become a French chef. Jefferson liked French cooking, and so he wanted a French chef for Monticello.
Okay.
And so he takes them over, and while he is there, the younger daughter, he's left 2 younger daughters with his sister-in-law in the company of Sally Hemings as sort of a companion, and they are at his sister-in-law's home. Now, in this convoluted story, the sister-in-law, of course, is Sally's half-sister.
Right.
So they're all there at Eppington, and one of the child dies, and one of the girls dies, Polly, and Jefferson at this point says, "I want my other daughter with me." And he wants to have his daughter Polly brought over by what he says a careful Negro woman, such as Isabel. Isabel Hearn was a woman, she was about 28 years old at that point. But instead, Elizabeth, another Elizabeth, all these people have the same names, his sister-in-law sends Sally Hemings over with the younger daughter. She's 14, so she's the minder for a 9-year-old.
Right.
And Abigail Adams is aghast. They go to London and to the Adams' house before they go to Paris, and she's like, "What is this kid doing with this other kid?"
She thought
essentially.
she was too young to be
Yeah,
supervised.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
but when Sally Hemings, make sure everybody understands, Sally Hemings' father was the same father as
Jefferson's wife.
Jefferson's wife. So so Sally Hemings was in effect the half-sister of his wife, is that right? So when he saw Sally Hemings the first time, or at least when she came over, she was then 14 years old. So he never actually saw his wife at 14, but he could imagine that's what she might have looked like.
Well, I mean, we don't know. Sally Hemings could have looked definitely like her half-sister, sometimes looked like
Because Sally Hemings was 3/4 white. And, okay, so Sally Hemings ultimately connects with Thomas Jefferson. They go to
That's the way to
Paris.
put it.
I didn't want to say hooked up. I was going to say hooked up, but I'd
Don't do
say...
that. My kids say never say hooks up.
Right,
Don't
right.
do
I didn't say that. So they connect, and they go to Paris, and then Sally Hemings is there, 14, and then the 2 daughters are there. So
Wait, no.
Is that right?
What happens is that instead of going to get his daughter, Jefferson sends one of his servants to get them, sends Adrian Petit to London to pick up the girls, and Abigail Adams is furious
that he didn't show up.
that he didn't show up because, as you know, your daughter,
Right.
you've made her come over here. She didn't want to come at first. You made her come over here, and now you're not even going to come to get her.
They
But
tricked her into
They,
sending...
they actually tricked her onto the boat. They had Sally Hemings go on the ship back in Virginia, and then they said, "Oh, we're just going to play a game." And then when she wakes up, she falls asleep. They're out to sea.
Right.
So this is what has happened, and so Abigail was not happy with him.
Okay, so Sally Hemings shows up in Paris. The 2 daughters are there, and Thomas Jefferson doesn't like living in Paris, or he loves living in Paris?
He loves living in Paris. He likes the music. He likes the architecture, the civilization. Was a little frightened of the women.
And was he was fairly flirtatious, or?
Well, fairly, but Ben Franklin was sort of a bon vivant. He was all out in Paris.
He was in a league by himself.
He was in a league by himself.
Right.
I mean, Jefferson was more a homebody. He went to salons, but he went to English-speaking salons, and he really didn't like the women, whom he thought were a little forward. He compared them Amazons to angels. An angel is a person who takes care of her husband and takes care of the children and keeps the home fires burning. The Amazons are women, he said, out in the streets, which like they're prostitutes almost, but
Right.
I mean they're out in the streets, seeking pleasure and talking politics.
Benjamin Franklin didn't have that problem.
No, he did not have that problem.
Right. So
He liked that kind of thing.
So okay. So now there's no slavery in France. Is that right?
No, there's slavery in the colonies. There's not supposed to be slavery in Paris. There are no slaves in France, they said, but sometimes French colonials did bring their slaves to Paris. And very often people there, when they did, they would petition for freedom. And every petition for freedom that was made in Paris during that time was granted. So it was pretty much a pro forma thing.
Okay. So at some point, Thomas Jefferson decides to go back to Monticello in Virginia. So he says to James Hemings, you're free, more or less, you could be free. I can't force you back, but you should come back. And what does he say to Sally Hemings?
Well, I mean, Sally Hemings doesn't, by this time, she is going to have a baby, and Madison Hemings said the baby is Jefferson's baby, and she did not want to go back to the United States because if she had a child in the United States, the child would be enslaved because slavery followed the mother. Whatever your mother was, you were. And Jefferson promises her that if she comes back with him, she will have a good life at Monticello. Any children they had would be freed when they were 21. And she agreed to that. And at the time, I should say at the time, nobody wanted to go. He was the only person who wanted to come back to the United States. His daughters didn't want to come back. His secretary, William Short, did not want to come back. James Hemings didn't want to come back. They were having the time of their lives there. And he was like, I'm losing control of all of these people. And he was the one who was keen on getting everybody home.
You indicated Madison Hemings said that the deal was you come back, your children, our children, will be freed at the age of 21 and so forth. But who was Madison Hemings, and when did he say this?
Okay. Madison Hemings was the third child who survived. Beverly was the male, was the oldest, and then there was Harriet, and then there's James. His name was James Madison Hemings. And he was born in 1805. He gave an interview to a reporter in 1873, the Pike County, Ohio Republican, when he was talking about his life at Monticello, and mentioned this and said this sort of not in passing, but it's not the main point of the recollections that he gives. It's sort of almost annoying in a way because that you wanted him to say all the stuff about you is really interesting, but we really want to know about your mother and father. But he's talking about his life in Ohio and life at Monticello.
So when they go back, they're back in Monticello. They then children are born to Sally Hemings. She then delivers 7 children, and 4 of them survive.
4 survive.
Okay, of those children, everyone was, let's say, conceived, presumably, at the time when Thomas Jefferson was there at Monticello? And he was there at the birth, or the time that every child was born, he was at Monticello?
No, not everyone. I think only 2 of them, Harriet and Eston.
Okay.
The other ones, Beverly and Madison, he was away.
So was it
He was at Washington.
Was it uncommon for slave owners to have affairs with, if affair is the right word, with their slaves?
Well, children with, so let's say, have children. No, yes, it was common. It was very common. And you can see that now in the DNA testing you can see it in the family histories of African American people, but now it's been confirmed by DNA, the sort of population geneticists who go around and test people and find, European Y male chromosomes in almost half of African American men.
So Thomas Jefferson is, when he comes back, he ultimately gets back in government matters. He becomes, when he comes back from France, he's made Secretary of State under George Washington. Ultimately quits, goes back, becomes Vice President under John Adams, and then he's elected our third president.
Yeah.
At the time he's running for president, does anybody mention Sally Hemings?
Yes, but not by name. In the stories, the rumors about him began around 1798 and 1799. They're sort of blind items. If you know page 6 of the Post, what senior statesman is known for, his interest in yellow-skinned women or whatever. Those kinds of things that sort of started appearing, and poems and so forth that people were writing about it, but not her name. Nobody mentioned Sally until James Callender, after he's president.
Who is James Callender?
James Callender was a Scottish emigre who came to the United States and was, I guess you could call him a journalist. And Jefferson was interested in his talents and had him, and paid him actually, supported him as he was writing some really pretty rough things about John Adams in the 1790s during a very, very contentious time.
Because Jefferson and Adams might be competitors to be president.
Oh yes, absolutely. So he, the Federalists were given as good as they got. They had the other side as well. He had supported Jefferson in the 1790s, and then under the Alien and Sedition Act, he was put in jail. By Adams's people from the laws that he supported. And Jefferson promised to pardon everybody who was put in jail for writing, allegedly seditious things about the president. And once he got to be president, he did. So Callender is out. Callender wants to be paid back for all of the work that he had done.
He wanted to be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars?
No. He wanted to be the postmaster of Richmond. The postmaster of Richmond, he wanted a patronage job, and he wanted that. And Jefferson, this is sort of, it happens, the people who are sort of attack dogs during a campaign, and then come and want to be like a secretary of something, and people say, no, you're an attack dog. We don't make you, the secretary of, you don't make you the postmaster of Richmond. We want responsible people opening the mail. And he said, no, I'm not going to give it to you. And then that's when James Callender says, I know all of these things about you that people have told me in Charlottesville and Richmond. He actually went to Charlottesville and Richmond and asked around Jefferson's neighbors. And he wrote a story in 1802 about called The President Again. And he's, by this wench, Sally, he has 5 children and so forth. And that's when it broke onto, not the national scene, but also the international scene. People wrote about it.
If somebody's accused of having children with a slave, which was not considered to be socially appropriate for whites in those days, certainly not for President of the United States, you presumably would respond. What did Jefferson say?
Nothing.
He just said...
He said nothing because first place, Jefferson was not a fool. He was many things, but not that. And not to say that Alexander Hamilton was, but just a few years before, Alexander Hamilton had gotten into trouble. And because people assumed that he was stealing from the Treasury, and he said, I'm not stealing from the Treasury. All those payments that I'm giving, they're for some other reason. And he basically admitted in a pamphlet that he was being extorted by the husband of a woman with whom he was sleeping, that he was carrying on an adulterous affair, thinking, oh, if I'm okay on the public side, this private stuff, that's not anybody's business. Of course, it ruined him. It was the worst thing for him to have done. So Jefferson was a very savvy politician, just shut up.
He didn't say, never...
No, his surrogates came out and said, oh, this didn't happen, and blah, 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 but he never
Jefferson never admitted it, never denied it.
No.
So when Jefferson is president, did Sally...
No, he did say things like, he had said, all of these lies, all these things they're saying about me are untrue. And so what people say is, aha, that's a denial, except it's really not, because they were saying lots of things about him.
So when he was president,
and some of them were true.
When he was president, did Sally Hemings ever come to the White House?
Don't know. People went back and forth between Monticello and the White House all the time, or the president's house, as it was called.
So when Jefferson is finished being president, he goes back to Monticello. And now he is back there. He's got his oldest daughter, the only surviving child, living there, Martha, and she has 11 children, or?
She had 12, but one died, so
Right.
she's 11
Okay,
kids.
11 children, and very fertile family. And
Well, everybody was. I mean, Sally Hemings had 7 kids. His first wife had 6, and then she died at 34.
so the scene is you've got 11 children, or some of them at some time, living there, are his grandchildren. He's got the children from Sally Hemings living there. What was it like? I mean, all these kids are.
What was it like? Well, that's the interesting thing. Madison Hemings describes Jefferson as being kind, but not. He says he was not in the habit of showing us partiality or fatherly affection. And what I think that means is that. But he was affectionate with his grandchildren, meaning, he bounced them on his knee and he was playful and all this kind of things. But he wasn't in the habit of doing that with them, is what they said. But when I was writing the Hemingses of Monticello, I had found them actually during the first book, but because my first book was very different, I didn't use it. There are several letters, about 6 letters, where he writes to his overseer at Poplar Forest. And he says, I'm coming up with Johnny Hemings and his 2 assistants. Now, all of the sons were apprenticed to John Hemings as the master carpenter. So he and Madison Hemings and Beverly and Eston would be at Poplar Forest, his retreat, for weeks at a time. So it's like, it's not a sense of him not being around them. It's that he's not acting towards them like they are his legitimate white children, which he wouldn't have done.
There's a report of that you have in your book about, I guess, a foreign dignitary or somebody is having dinner at Monticello, and he looks up and seeing he's being served food by a servant who looks like Thomas Jefferson, who was his, presumably his son from Sally Hemings. Was that kind of unusual or not?
I don't know that story is actually true.
It's a good story.
It's a great story. No, it's too good to check. No, but I don't know. I don't know that story is true, because the time that they're saying that, her children wouldn't be of that age, and they weren't servants. They worked with John Hemings. So that seems out of character. That seems like it's probably one of those things that people said, which.
So, but why didn't Thomas Jefferson just say, I'm in love with you. I'm with you for 38 years of my life. Why don't we get married? Why couldn't they just get married?
What?
It was against the law.
It's against the law.
It was against the law.
Get married. They couldn't marry. You couldn't marry in Virginia until 1967.
But some people.
Loving versus Virginia.
In some
Supreme Court.
cases, Sally Hemings had a sister who lived with a man in Charlottesville. Yeah. And they were kind of not married, but they were kind of living together openly. Why couldn't Thomas Jefferson be more open about it? Or why do you think he wasn't?
Well, she was living there with him. I don't know what else she could do besides what they were doing. The neighbors were saying they're living together. They cohabit. He's talking about Mary Hemings, who lived with Thomas Bell, who was a merchant and a friend of Jefferson's, and they, corresponded, visited each other, and so forth. And when he died, he actually left Mary Hemings the house and property, which you can't do to a slave, but you can do it if people in the community go along with it.
So people often ask you, I'm sure, well, how did these deeds get done? How did Sally Hemings slip into his bedroom? And you might describe how he set up his house so that nobody could actually go into his bedroom unless presumably they knew a certain code to the lock, or they came in through a certain door.
Well, I mean, Sally Hemings, her job, Madison Hemings said, and other people said as well, was to take care of Jefferson's rooms. She was his chambermaid, and she kept, took care of his wardrobe and his room. So she was supposed to be there. There would be a reason for her to be coming in and out. But he had, in the early 1800s, when he was president, built onto his bedroom a set. You can see it now if you go to Monticello, a porch and a sort of covered porch and steps. You could get into Jefferson's room from the outside. There are multiple ways to get in, from the outside or from the inside, and he could leave without people knowing on the inside that he'd gone, basically from that. So it's sort of an interesting way of setting up his life. Very, very private. He had special locks on his door that could be locked remotely, and double blinds, just very, very, and sort of a panel next to his bed, extreme privacy, and nobody, Margaret Baird Smith said that nobody could get into his room unless he let them in, because he was the person who had the key, and presumably Sally
His room
Hemings.
was his bedroom, he had like a little bathroom kind of, and then he had his library
study.
and his study. That's what that was.
It was sort of like
Right.
it was built as sort of almost, he conceived of this when he was in Paris. It's built for maximum comfort for himself, not so much for other people, but he didn't think that, people talk about the narrow staircases at Monticello, but those rooms were built just for visitors. He didn't know in the 1790s that his daughter was going to get married and that her husband was going to fail and that they would all have to move into the house in 1809. That was not his thought. So it's very private, bachelor quarters. He's pretty clearly not going to get married again.
So what happens in history? James Callender says these things about Thomas Jefferson. He never admits them, never denies them, more or less, but he says they're scurrilous, let's say. When history is starting to be written about Thomas Jefferson, after he dies in 1826, historians begin to write about him, but do they mention the Sally Hemings thing, or does that just go away, or people assume that actually that the father was somebody else?
Well, they mention it to sort of suggest that it's not true. And then one Henry Randall is the most famous early biographer of Jefferson, gets access to a letter, actually a letter that, or actually tells another Jefferson biographer that he had seen a letter and actually talked to one of Jefferson's grandchildren who said, well, the reason Sally Hemings' children look just like Jefferson is that they are the children of his nephew, one of the Carrs. And, people can look like their cousins, look like one another, but that's the story that they tell. And so historians believe that. And part of my first book was to ask, why do you believe this? I mean, if you're looking at documents, in the course of telling this story, the grandchildren say multiple things that are not true. And typically that makes you distrust people, but it didn't with the historians. All they were focusing on was that he said, that they were saying he didn't do it. So an alternative story that is accepted in history is that it was Jefferson's nephew who fathered the children, even though there's no connection.
Mr. Carr?
Yeah, the Carr, one of the Carr nephews,
so,
Carr sons.
When you write your first book, you kind of go through documentary evidence, you do a lot of research, and you kind of say, this seems unlikely that the historical acceptance of Carr as the father is probably true, it's probably Thomas Jefferson. But then DNA evidence comes out, and the DNA evidence shows what?
Shows a connection between the Hemings descendant that they tested and the Jefferson descendants. No connection. The Carrs are a totally different group of people, the Y chromosome. And another family, a black family, the Woodsons, who had claimed descent from Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which I denied in my first book, and had some very, very very sharp conversations with members of that family about it. It showed that there was, in fact, no connection between the two of them.
So the DNA evidence comes out, and I guess that's case closed. All the white descendants of Thomas Jefferson agree that this is...
No.
Oh, they didn't agree?
No, they didn't agree. No, they didn't agree, and many of them don't agree. Even today, they say, no, it must have been another Jefferson. First it was the Carrs, and then now it's because they didn't know when they picked the Carrs. Of course, Jefferson's grandchildren couldn't know that there would one day be a time when you could differentiate between maternal relatives and paternal relatives. So they picked the most convenient people. And the people who had been writing to me saying, it's the Carrs, like the next day after the DNA came out, started saying, oh, it must be another a Jefferson relative, because it just cannot be him. Cannot be he who did this.
So there are people who write books that say it was Jefferson's brother.
Yeah, Jefferson's brother.
But based on the DNA evidence, seems unlikely.
Well, it's not the DNA evidence. I mean, the DNA evidence is part of it, because it kills the Carr story, which is the story that the family had been telling. It's the other stuff as well. The pattern of her conceptions, the names of the children, they're all named for his friends and favorite relatives. diary entries from some of his friends about all of it. I mean, it's just
Okay, well, let's say that some
Little stuff.
relatives or descendants don't say it, but the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns Monticello, Thomas Jefferson Foundation bought Monticello from the Levy family.
Yeah.
It was said in the 1920s that having a Jewish family own Monticello was un-American.
yeah.
And as a result of that, the Levy family had to give it up and sell it to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. So the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, now, do they agree with your analysis?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And so now, when you go to Monticello and the film that they show, it says most historians believe that he was the father of all of her children. That's a part of the story. They are now going to be interpreting her room, what they take to be her room for a particular time at Monticello. The Washington Post just had an article about that, and we've been talking about that for several months, for a while actually. But yeah, that is something that they accept. And I think most people, strangely enough, most people in America believed the story, I think, before my book and the DNA. I don't think they had much of a problem with it. It was mainly historians who were really upset about it.
So Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law had 6 children with Sally Hemings' mother.
Yeah.
So, and lots of slave owners were having children with their slaves. So what's the big deal about Thomas Jefferson? It is presumably that he wrote the famous sentence, all men are created equal, and he yet was a slave owner, and he's impregnating a slave and so forth. So is it because Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence that it gets this much attention?
I think so, because of what he symbolizes. He is a symbol of America. And if you say that a symbol of America had children with an African-American woman, a person who had been considered under, even though she's mainly white, African-American, then in a way it's like saying the country is not really white. And that's a lot for some people to take. I mean, the founding fathers are typically looked to as a way of excluding people. Well, they weren't talking about you. I mean, these are our fathers. But if you have somebody who was like literally an actual father of people who were non-white, that messes the story up.
By the way, when Thomas Jefferson died, he died on July the 4th, 1826, the same day as
John Adams.
And
50th anniversary of the Declaration.
did he, 50th anniversary, correct, and did he honor his commitment to free the children of Sally Hemings?
Yes, he did. The 2 eldest, William Beverly, and Harriet, he writes in the farm book that they ran away, but they left. He put Harriet on a stagecoach. Beverly left a few months before her, and they go to Washington, and we don't really know what happened to them. That's something I would like to try to hopefully be able to find out. Madison and Eston are freed in his will. Sally Hemings is not formally freed.
Why?
She's not, well, we don't know why. I mean, because he didn't say why. But if you think of what would have happened if he did free her, you might understand why he wouldn't do it. Because in 1806, they passed a law saying that if you were freed, any enslaved person who was freed had to get permission from the legislature to remain in the state. So he would have had to write to the legislature and say, he did for the sons, but for her. And he would have to say, would you, gentlemen of the legislature, would you allow Sally Hemings to, stay in Virginia? And because she was over 45, he would have to have detailed how he planned to take care of her. So then he would say, and here's what I'm going to, the money and the land that I'm going to provide for. It would be a total admission that this had happened. And his daughter, I think he would have thought it would have been humiliating. Martha Randolph, his daughter, was the most important person in Jefferson's life. There's no question about it. And to humiliate her and her children by making these public statements, when all he had to do was to say, go into town and live the rest of your life, which is what happened. As in the 1830 census, she's listed as a free white woman. In the 1833 census, she's listed as a free colored woman. So, there's law in the books, and there's law in the way it works. And in that community, everybody knew who she was.
Now, do we know much about her? Do we know what she looked like? Was she literate? Could she read and write?
We don't know if she was literate. We know her brothers, Robert and James, were literate. there's a very, very long list of French cooking utensils that that James, in his own hand, he corresponded. Robert and Jefferson corresponded. All those letters are missing.
Now, Jefferson was fastidious about keeping track of all of his letters. He had a special machine, so he wrote a letter, and then there was another pen that was writing the same thing. So we have copies of 14,000 or so of his letters?
About 19,000.
19,000. Okay, 19,000 letters. Does he ever mention Sally Hemings once?
Oh, yeah.
And what does he say about her?
Well, you're given instructions about firewood to be taken to her place and other people's place as well. Just mundane things, but not much, not many things at all. She comes back from France and she pretty much disappears from the family records.
And his children, by her, passed as whites. They were 7/8 white.
Well, yeah, by Virginia law, they were white. It was not the one-drop rule. It was if you were 7/8 white, you were considered to be white. The two eldest, as I said, go off to live as white people. The two youngest stay in the black community until Eston, the absolute youngest, doesn't feel that his children can have many opportunities in Ohio. Their actual article, he was a violinist. He made his living as a musician, and there are articles about him and his daughter, who was a pianist and so forth. But there was only so far they could go. So he takes his family and moves to Madison, Wisconsin, changes his name from Eston Hemings to E.H. Eston Hemings Jefferson, and he goes by E.H. Jefferson. They become white. His sons become prominent in Madison community and so forth. So, yeah, he becomes white. Madison Hemings is the only one who stays in the black community.
The fact that these children are all named after friends of Thomas Jefferson, is that a clue?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you listed all of his children and all of his grandchildren, he had the privilege of naming his grandchildren, you wouldn't be able to tell who was whom.
So let's talk about, this is getting up to the great paradox of America. We have a country where we started saying that all men are to be created equal, and everyone's supposed to be able to pursue happiness. Yet the people who enslaved these so many slaves were the founding fathers. So how do you square people who are so intelligent as Thomas Jefferson, who are brilliant in so many different areas? How could they have been slave owners? How do you square those two things?
Well, I don't know that we have to, but Jefferson knew slavery was wrong, and he believed slavery was wrong. But there are many things that we believe about our lives, intellectual ideas that we have that we can't live up to for emotional reasons, for lack of, you want to say lack of character, lack of strength or whatever. The people who freed slaves in the 18th century during Jefferson's time are people who are under the influence of religion, mainly, and he was not in the way that the Quakers were, evangelical, Methodists and Baptists.
Some people question whether he was really Christian.
I think he was a Christian. He's a Christian in his own way. My co-author and I, Peter Owen, have argued about this quite a bit.
Didn't he do his own Bible where he took out some of the miracles of Christ, and he kind of have his own Bible where he took out things that he didn't believe in the Bible?
Well, yeah, he did do that. What he left what he thought were Jesus' pure teachings, and not the things that people had added on to Jesus, that Jesus never said that he did. That was his view.
Jefferson, his view was that whites and blacks, if they were equal, could not live together in a society. Is that right? So his early view was that slavery was wrong, but blacks should leave the country?
There should be the liberal position for Jefferson and Marshall and Madison and people of that time was that there should be emancipation and expatriation. At first he thought out west, that blacks should go out west, and then once it was clear that the West was going to be for white people, that no, there should be some other place. But there was he said whites would never give up their prejudices against blacks. Blacks would never forgive whites for what they had done. And there would be a race war. And we kind of laugh at that, except, we kind of have had sort of one. Racial conflict. We congratulate ourselves. We have come very, very far, but it hasn't been easy. It's not easy now.
Now, you've studied Jefferson for a large number of years, many books on him, and you're working on another one. Do you admire him more now that you've researched him as much as you have, or do you admire him less now that you know more about him?
I admire things about him. I think I think doing the last book with my co-author, where we're focusing more on the later part of his life, and as I get to be older, I realize how hard it is to do anything in the world, and that it's tough to accomplish something. And he accomplished a lot, and there was a lot that he didn't accomplish, and I feel much more, humbled, thinking, well, what is it that I've done, in comparison? And he helped start a country, and the idea was that the next generation of people would carry things forward. But to say, all right, you start a country, you're a vice president, you're a president, you found a university, how come you didn't end slavery, is a bit much for me. I think he did not have, that's our passion, and it should be our passion to think about race and slavery and all those things, but his passion was, we have started a country, and was always fearful that it wasn't going to work. I was about to say, we know it worked. Well, yeah, okay,
it has
all right,
worked.
it has worked. But he didn't know that it was going to work, and that's what it's clear, that's what it is. It's clearer to me now how paranoid he was and how intent he was on making the experiment go. And all these other things he thought, okay, the slavery thing will take care of itself. But how many times in life have I or other people thought, well, if I could just get here, that other thing will take care of itself. And that other thing is the thing. And he could not see that slavery was going to be until Missouri, the conflict, when he says the slavery will be the rock upon which the Union is split. And this is in 1821, but before then, it's all, it's those Federalists. If I could just get the politics right, everything else will work out, and that's completely naive.
Suppose Thomas Jefferson was sitting here and you have a chance to interview him and say, okay, would you say, is it true it's about Sally Hemings, or what would be the question you would ask him?
Well, if he were here now, I'd say, well, what do you think about all this? No, but seriously, if a question that he could answer on his own, I'd ask him if he was going to make white men send their children back to Africa. What would be the basis for it? Because when he's writing the will, and he's doing the petition to the legislature about letting the men that he is freeing stay in Virginia, and he says, this is where their family and their connections are. And that's the answer to why every African American should stay in the United States. And so he knew that about the people in his life. I'm not going to send Burl Colbert and John Hemings back to Africa because their mothers, their fathers, land where my fathers died. He understood that in his day-to-day life. But thinking about things and a blueprint for the country, this is not going to work. It can't work on a large scale.
Let's talk about a few other things that Jefferson did, not relating to Sally Hemings
Yeah.
and slavery. So he wrote the Declaration of Independence at the age of 33. Did he put a lot of time into it? Some people say he sort of plagiarized what other people had written. What do you think about that?
No, he put a lot of time in it, but he didn't have plagiarism in the sense that we think of it today. He's very clear in saying these were not ideas that I thought up myself. What he was trying to do was to get the common sense of the people at that time, how they felt about things. Sure, there were influences, and he didn't see himself as like an oracle bringing forth something new. This was stating principles that he thought were universal and would be clear.
But the Continental Congress, what he said, mutilated what he had written, and he was very upset about it. He sat mute and didn't really object to what they were doing, but he didn't actually admit that he was the author for many, many years. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it was not known. His authorship wasn't really known until the 1790s. And then once he becomes actually we could get parties, actual political parties, his authorship became a way of sort of standing up to the idea that he was as good as Washington, who was the head of the Federalist Party, that he was the person who was responsible for this. So it was useful at that time.
So on his tombstone, what does he choose to put as the first thing? author of the Declaration of Independence.
Yep, that, and Statute for Religious Freedom, and then the founder of the University of Virginia.
So, because of the Hamilton play, we know more about, or at least we read more about or hear more about Jefferson than maybe we did before. Was he really an arch enemy of Hamilton? What was the real basis for that?
At first they were not enemies, but then he became an arch enemy because he actually believed that Hamilton and the Federalist Party were counter-revolutionaries. After you have a revolution, there's a counter-revolution, and he thought that these people, Hamilton, who wanted a president to serve for life, a Senate to serve for life, Jefferson, after we've gotten rid of a king, why would we do that? That was his thinking. So anybody who could conceive of that after they had gotten rid of George III, he thought, oh, and Hamilton talked about the British Constitution as the greatest thing that was ever. So they became enemies.
In the first cabinet, Thomas Jefferson served as Secretary of State under George Washington, but then he was sort of getting people to say negative things about George Washington while he was Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Wasn't that kind of not a good thing to do?
Well, he couldn't. Well, yeah. Jefferson was a modern politician. Right now, where we have people who don't, he had newspapers, a newspaper that was devoted to criticizing the administration. Right now, he would be one of those sources, those unnamed sources in the New York Times that are trying to, to say, they think save the Union in some way. Yeah, that was the thing about him. People saw him as underhanded and deceptive, but he was really practicing tactics that we do now quite.
But Washington got mad at him, and ultimately they stopped talking?
Yeah, well, Washington got mad at him because Jefferson kept trying to convince him that Alexander Hamilton was the devil. And Washington didn't believe that. And he didn't like the bickering because people didn't think, strangely enough, they didn't think that you should have parties, that there shouldn't be factions. Right. In Federalist 10, Madison talks about the problem with factions. They thought that if you could come to the public interest, there shouldn't be parties. People should get together and find out what that was. So for Washington to see people, criticizing the government or the Democratic Republican clubs that were springing up that he thought were unconstitutional, Washington didn't like that kind of partisan bickering.
So in hindsight, one of the greatest things Jefferson did, in my view at least, I'm curious your view, was the Louisiana Purchase when he was president. But how could he justify that when he was a small government person and there's no authority in the Constitution for buying half of the country? How did he justify that?
Well, he thought you might need a constitutional amendment, and so he drafted one, but then put it in the drawer. And thought he really didn't need it. The first law is self-preservation, and he thought that expanding the country, actually taking the entire continent, was the safest thing to do. Because if you had part of the country under the dominion and the control of other countries, there would always be an attempt to pull people back into European power politics. So he justified it by saying that this is something that will ultimately be for the safety of the United States.
In terms of his intellect, you've had a chance to read his letters and so forth. Would you say on the IQ scale, would he do 800 SATs, or was he a pretty smart person?
He's a pretty smart person. I think he probably, if he were alive today, probably would be an engineer or an architect or something like that. He was mechanical.
A private equity investor or something?
Oh, yeah. He'd be great with numbers.
Right.
But no, I don't know the business sense. I don't know.
But Pauline Maier, who was a distinguished historian at MIT, said that he was the most overrated man in American history. You have agreement?
I love Pauline, but I think she's wrong.
Okay. So let's, you would say he deserves his memorial in Washington, D.C. and everything?
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, the grid of the country is a Jefferson grid. I mean, the Library of Congress. I mean, there are just too many things that he was involved in, whether you like him or not. History is not just about all the people you like. It's about people who've done things that are important and help shape the country, and he did.
So let's talk for a few moments we have remaining about two other books you've written. You wrote a book with Vernon Jordan. I guess you were the co-author of it, really, but you really were the author of it. Well,
Were you there? No, go ahead.
But Vernon gives you all the credit for it.
Yes, he does. He does.
So,
he's very gentlemanly.
it's called Vernon Can Read. What does that title mean?
It's a story that he tells about an employer for whom he worked when he was in college, and when he went back to Atlanta, who was surprised to know that Vernon could actually read. And he sort of comes to dinner he's the butler at this point, he's serving dinner, and the man announces, Vernon can read, to his family. And so he thought that would be a good title, because it sort of shows the way people underestimate African Americans, the way he was underestimated, and the way other African Americans are often underestimated.
Vernon
So it's a
Jordan,
great title.
who I know as well, many people here may know, he has many great qualities. One of them is his great voice and his great elocution. Where did he get that from?
I don't know, but it's wonderful. I have all the tapes of him. It was wonderful doing the transcriptions, because what we did was I interviewed him, and he would tell the stories. And I actually interviewed some of his friends, too, the people with whom he'd grown up, people who knew him as a young man. And no, he has a great presentation. He's a very good-looking guy.
You wrote another book about Andrew Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
Now, how did if Lincoln had lived, would Reconstruction have worked better, or was Andrew Johnson just not fit to be vice president?
Andrew Johnson was not fit to be, he might have been okay as vice president, but he was not fit to be vice president coming into the presidency. He didn't have the right temperament for the presidency. He did not know how to compromise. He didn't know how... He did not know how to compromise.
Could he admit mistakes?
He
or
could
no?
not admit mistakes.
Did not do that either?
He couldn't admit mistakes. He wasn't good at compromise. He says, "I'm right, and by God, I know I am," and he hated black people. So you have this situation where the enslaved people are freed, and the person who's in charge of the White House is somebody who actually, I don't mean the sort of typical prejudice of the time. Even his associate said, one of them said, "I fear the president has an unconquerable prejudice against the Negro." And what you don't want to say bad luck doesn't even begin to describe it, what a tragedy it was at that particular moment to have someone who had that kind of sensibility. He'd grown up very, very poor. He didn't learn to read until he was about 17 or 18. His wife taught him how to write.
So you could have written, the title was Andrew Can Read?
Andrew Can Read. I mean, the papers of Andrew Johnson are very, consist mainly of to Andrew Johnson as opposed to writing. He was very uncomfortable.
Explain this to some people who may not understand. Lincoln has his first vice president is Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, but he gets rid of him.
He gets rid of him and brings in Johnson.
But Johnson was from Tennessee. How could somebody from Tennessee be on the Republican Party ticket?
Well, because he remained in the Union. I mean, that's the most admirable thing about him. He was against the Confederacy. He believed in the Union. He was a staunch Jackson man, and Jackson had said the Union forever, and he stuck with that. So what Lincoln wanted to do was to he's always signaling to people, signaling to the South, see, we can do this. I could bring, it's a border state to be sure,
right,
but I could bring him in, and we can work together. See, this can work. So that's what he did, and it was a mistake.
So in the end, he was impeached, but got off in the Senate trial, was not convicted. And do you think he was unfairly impeached?
No, I don't think he was unfairly impeached. I mean, the Tenure of Office Act was later declared unconstitutional, but it was the law at the time, and he broke it. And there were other reasons that I think in the little book that I did, I explained why I thought there were other things that he did that could be considered high crimes and misdemeanors. And
so
that should have gone.
The book that won the Pulitzer Prize is Hemings of Monticello. I highly, highly recommend. It's one of the best biographies and historical books I've ever written. Read. I wish I had written it. But it's highly, highly recommended. It's really, despite its great length. It's one that you really can't put down. And so you're going to write a successor to this?
Yes,
or?
I will. I'll take them into the 19th century. One family, I mentioned Eston's family goes into the white community, and Madison stays in the black community. They're in the Civil War, serving as white people, all serving as white people on the Union side. And then Jefferson's legal grandson, George Wythe Randolph, is the Secretary of the Confederacy for a time. So you have all of these people from Monticello who have this Monticello connection, who are on opposite sides of this, and in a very, very interesting way.
And this is your current book, and you wrote this with a professor at University of Virginia, and this is Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. It's overall about Thomas Jefferson's life.
And he calls himself that. So we didn't call him Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. He refers to himself in that way in a letter, and we sort of thought that was interesting that a person who is a Democrat Republican calls himself a patriarch. What does he mean by that, and why does he see that that's his worldview?
So you have two children. You and your husband have two children. Your husband is here, right there, Judge. Thank you very much. So are your two children interested in history?
Kinda. One wants to be a filmmaker. The other one wants to change the world.
Okay.
So we'll see what she does with that. But they, pardon me? I have my daughter, is the one who wants to change the world. My son is the one who wants to make films. So we'll see how
and
that
both
goes.
are highly paid professions, right?
To change the world one, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for a great conversation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.